Hello, everybody. We are on chapter 5 in Oliver Twist. Let me adjust this a little bit so I'm more in the center without actually knocking it off. There we go. Okay, at Mr. Brownlow's house. One morning, Oliver sought permission to go out. He went with Dodger and Charlie Bates. Oliver was wondering where they were going. The boys walked at a lazy pace. Watching them, Oliver thought that they would deceive Fagin by not working at all, but would just spend their time in leisure. They were passing from a corner near Clerkenwell when the Dodger stopped suddenly, lay his finger on his lips to indicate silence, and drew his companions back with great caution. "What's the matter?" asked Oliver. "Hush," replied Dodger. "Do you see the old man at the bookstall?" "Yes, I see him," said Oliver. "He'll do," said the Dodger. Oliver stood looking in amazement. The old gentleman was very respectable looking, with gray hair and gold-rimmed spectacles. He was dressed in a dark coat and trousers, and carried a smart bamboo cane under his arm. He had taken a book from the stall, and he stood there reading with deep concentration, as if he were in his own study. With horror and alarm, Oliver stood a few paces off, looking on with his eyes as wide open as they could possibly go. Dodger plunged his hand into the old gentleman's pocket and drew out a handkerchief. He then handed the same to Charlie Bates, and then they both ran away around the corner at full speed. In an instant, the whole mystery of the handkerchiefs, watches, jewelry, and Fagin rushed upon the boy's mind. He stood for a moment, and then he decided to run off. In the instant when Oliver began to run, the old gentleman put his hand into his pocket, and missing his handkerchief, he turned around. Seeing Oliver run away at a rapid pace, he concluded that Oliver was the thief. He shouted, "Stop, thief!" and he ran after Oliver at full speed. A crowd gathered, all of them following the wretched boy, who was panting with exhaustion. He was stopped at last. Someone had given him a smart blow. He was down on the pavement, and the crowd gathered around him. Oliver lay, covered with mud and dust, bleeding from his mouth, looking wildly at the crowd. The crowd asked the gentleman if Oliver was the pickpocket. "Yes, I am afraid it is a boy," said the gentleman. A police officer arrived, and seized Oliver by the collar. "It wasn't me, indeed, but 2 other boys," said Oliver, but no one believed him. He was marched to the police station. The stone cell at the police station was too dirty. Oliver was put in a lockup. The old gentleman looked at Oliver's face and said, "There is something in this boy's face that touches me. Can he be innocent? He looks like, bless my soul, where have I seen someone like him before?" He tried to remember the faces he knew, but he could not remember whom Oliver resembled. He was roused by a touch on the shoulder. Mr. Fang, the magistrate, was ready to hear the case. Oliver was trembling in fear as he was put in the wooden pen in one corner of the room. Mr. Fang was in a bad mood, and he thought Oliver was pretending innocence, especially when Oliver fainted in the middle of the hearing. He was given hard labor for 3 months as punishment, just when an elderly, decent-looking man rushed in. He asked them to stop, for he had something to say. He owned a bookstall in the road where the theft had taken place. He had watched the act of the pickpocket, but could not arrive earlier as there was no one to mind his bookstall. What he said revealed Oliver's innocence. With his own eyes, he had seen 3 boys, Oliver and 2 other boys. He said the robbery was committed by the other 2, and that this boy was completely surprised by it. Thus proved innocent, Oliver was cleared of his offense. He was carried out. The old gentleman on whom the theft was committed was Mr. Brownlow. Mr. Brownlow called for a coach and took Oliver with him. The coach drove away and stopped near a neat house on a quiet street in Pentonville. Oliver was taken inside the house, which belonged to Mr. Brownlow. Oliver stayed there for many days. He lay ill and unresponsive. Thin and frail, he seemed at last to be waking up from some distant and troubled dream. "Where have I been brought to?" he finally asked in a feeble voice. An elderly lady, neat and well-dressed, came up to him. "Hush, dear," she told Oliver gently. "You must be quiet or you will be ill again." She smoothed back his hair and put his head on the pillow. This lady was Mrs. Bedwin, who was Mr. Brownlow's devoted housekeeper, and she was very kind. A doctor arrived. He examined Oliver and said that all he needed was rest. After a few days, Oliver had recuperated well enough to be taken down to the kitchen. He sat in an easy chair and had broth and toast. In a room downstairs, Oliver saw, oops, missed a page, a portrait of a lady with a kind and a pretty looking face. He could not take his eyes off the canvas. "She is so very pretty," said Oliver, "but her eyes look so sorrowful. Where I sit, she seems to fix her eyes on me," he added in a low voice. "Lord save us," said Mrs. Bedwin. "Don't talk that way, child. You are weak and nervous after your illness. Let me wheel your chair to the other side, and then you will not see it." He had scarcely finished the last spoonful of his broth when there was a soft knocking at the door. Mr. Brownlow walked in. He stopped suddenly, pointed at the picture above Oliver's head, and then at the boy's face. Oliver's face was a living copy of the lady in the portrait. Oliver, still weak in mind and body, fainted. As Oliver recovered from the fainting fit, a topic of the portrait was avoided. The portrait was removed before he came down for breakfast the next day. Mrs. Bedwin explained to Oliver it was taken down because Mr. Brownlow thought it might worry you and stand in the way of you getting well. When you are fit and fine, we'll hang it up again. Oliver's days of recovery were happy. Everyone around was kind to him. They all had gentle manners, and the house was always neat and in proper order. Oliver found peace and appreciated it deeply. Some days later, Oliver was talking to Mrs. Bedwin when a message arrived saying that Mr. Brownlow had called him to his study. It seemed he wanted to discuss something with the boy. Oliver entered the study. He was amazed to see thick, bound books lining every wall of the room. "There are a good many books, are there not, my boy?" Mr. Brownlow said, observing with curiosity the curiosity with which Oliver surveyed the shelves that reached from the floor to the ceiling. "A great number, sir," replied Oliver. "I never saw so many." "You shall read them, then, if you behave well," the old gentleman said kindly, "and you will like that better than looking at the outsides. However, there are some books of which the backs and covers are by far the best parts." Then Mr. Brownlow drew his chair towards Oliver, and sitting close to him, he said, "Now, let me hear your story." And that is the end of chapter 5.